This is the Miami Dolphins instant reaction of Game 5 of the 2022 NFL season. This game was against the New York Jets, and the Finns would come away, unfortunately, with a 40-17 loss against these New York Jets. The story of the game would be almost immediately upon the first offensive possession for the Dolphins, literally on the first play, Teddy Bridgewater would drop back, fake a handoff, and would end up getting hit by the blitzing Sauce Gardner, cornerback for the New York Jets, and would end up getting put in concussion protocol and would be ruled out for the rest of the game, literally on the first play. And not only what was it a play that they would lose their starting quarterback of this day, but it was also ruled a safety, an intentional grounding call that came out of their own end zone. Let's talk about the overall scope of stats when it comes to this game, and then we'll go over the summary of the entire game. The Miami Dolphins would be led by Skylar Thompson at the quarterback spot. Skylar Thompson coming in literally after the first offensive play, which would result in a safety. And he would go 19 out of 33, throwing for 166 yards, gaining an average of 5 yards per pass, throwing an interception, getting sacked twice for 8 yards, finishing with an abysmal 28.2 quarterback rating and an overall 58.4 passer rating. The Dolphins would be led in rushing by Raheem Mostert, who would have his best performance so far of his Miami Dolphins career, going 18 carries for 113 yards with a 6.3 average per carry. He would score a touchdown, which was one of the highlights of this game, the positive highlights of this game for the Finns, and he'd get a long of 24 yards. Besides that, we would only see a combination of 8 rushes from 4 different players throughout this game, yards per reception. This would be followed by Mike Gesicki, who would only have 1 reception for 30 yards off of 2 targets. Defensively, the Dolphins would be led by Brandon Jones, who had totaled 9 tackles, 5 of them solo, along with achieving a sack. And he would be followed by Landon Roberts, who'd have a total of 7 tackles, 4 of them for solo, followed by Christian Wilkins, who would get a total of 6 tackles. The Dolphins would finish with the day with 2 sacks, and the second sack was done by Jerome Baker. In terms of forced defensive turnovers, the Dolphins were not able to force neither any fumbles nor any interceptions. In terms of kicking, the Dolphins kicker Jason Sanders would go 1 for 2, and then Thomas Morstead would have 3 total punts, achieving 131 yards. For the Jets would be led by Zach Wilson at quarterback. He would go 14 out of 21, throwing for 210 yards with an average yards per pass at 10 yards. He would not throw neither a touchdown nor an interception. He would get sacked twice for 23 yards, finishing with a QBR of 56, while an overall passer rating of 99.3. The New York Jets' rushing attack was the story of this game. Breece Hall, the rookie, would get 18 carries, rushing for 97 yards, finishing with a total of 5.4 yards per carry. He would score a touchdown, and he would be followed by Michael Carter out of UNC, who would get 10 carries for 21 yards, but scoring 2 touchdowns. Besides this, we also saw Braxton Berrios, who would score a 15-yard touchdown on a run, and Zach Wilson, who also would rush for a touchdown. So in total, the New York Jets rushed for 5 touchdowns in this game. In terms of receiving, not only would Breece Hall lead his team in rushing, he would also lead his team in receiving, getting only 2 receptions off of 2 targets, but gaining 100 yards, 79 of them coming on one of those receptions. After him, Corey Davis would come in second, a distant second at that, getting 2 receptions for 38 yards off of 4 targets, followed by Garrett Wilson, who'd also get 3 receptions for 27 yards, and then CJ Uzama, formerly of the Cincinnati Bengals, who would get 2 receptions for 12 yards. In terms of the New York Jets defense, the Jets would be led by C.J. Mosley, who would get a total of 10 tackles, seven of them solo, followed by Quan Alexander, who would get also 10 tackles, 6 of them solo. The Jets would finish the day with a total of 2 sacks, which would be shared between the first one shared between Quinnen Williams and John Franklin Myers, and the second one by Carl Lawson. The Jets would get an interception, which was intercepted by their first-round draft pick of last year, Sauce Gardner. Gardner would finish with 5 total tackles, 3 of them solo, along with a quarterback hit and a pass defensed. For the kicking return game, Braxton Berrios, after that safety that occurred in the first offensive play for the Miami Dolphins, off of a booming Thomas Morstead punt, Braxton Berrios would bring that punt back 42 yards, and he would finish the day off of 2 returns for 61 yards. In terms of the kicking game, the Jets would have one opportunity to kick a field goal, and they would go 1 for 1. Greg Zuerlein going 1 for 1 off a 34-yard field goal. Braden Mann would punt the ball 4 total times, finishing with 185 yards, 2 of those falling inside the 20, finishing the day with a 46.3 yards per punt average with a long 51. So those are the stats of this game. Now let's talk about an overall scope of this game, and then we'll talk a little bit about what could be coming in the next game against the Minnesota Vikings. So let's talk about the overall scope of this game and see how it played out the way it did. Because even though the score shows up as 40-17, for a good portion of this game, it was a lot closer than what it ended up. The New York Jets would have the opportunity to possess the ball first in this game, and they would go 4 plays for a total of 19 yards, which would culminate in a 48-yard Braden Mann punt, which would be down inside the Miami Dolphins 10-yard line at the 8-yard line. As we all know, the ensuing play for the Miami Dolphins, Teddy Bridgewater drops back, fakes the handoff, and as he's about to throw the ball away, he throws it in an area where there was no receivers present. And since he was in his own end zone, the play was deemed a safety. Right after that play, Teddy Bridgewater would be evaluated for a concussion. And even though he got up perfectly fine, he did not stumble, he essentially was ruled out the rest of the game right after that play. The announcement itself was made at or right after halftime. I did not see anything that made it seem like he needed to be ruled out, but I honestly think that a lot of this just had to do with the controversy behind the Tua Tagovailoa situation, along with the outcry both publicly and inside other team circles regarding dealing with concussions. After that safety, we'd see 2 straight punts, one by the Jets, one by the Dolphins, followed by a field goal scored by the Jets off a 7-play, 56-yard drive, which would culminate in that 34-yard field goal by Greg Zuerlein. Following play for the Dolphins, 3 plays, total of 8 yards, end up in a punt. Following play for the Jets would take 2 plays to score a touchdown. That touchdown set up by a 79-yard reception by Breece Hall, which would get run in by Michael Carter from the Miami Dolphins 1 yard line. At that point, the score is 12-0. The Dolphins' ensuing possession would take 8 plays and go 75 yards, which was driven heavily by the Miami Dolphins' rushing attack, led by Raheem Mostert, and would culminate in a 12-yard rush by Raheem Mostert to score a touchdown and bring the game back to 12-7. Ensuing New York Jets possession, 3 plays for a total of 4 yards, would end up in a punt. Ensuing Miami Dolphins possession, it would only take 2 plays, and on that second play, on a pass intended for River Craycraft, that was intercepted by Sauce Gardner. That interception would set up a 9-play, 53-yard drive that totaled 5 minutes and 22 seconds, and it would end up with a Zach Wilson rushing touchdown. And that would bring the score to 19-7. Just before the end of the first half, the Dolphins would go 11 plays for 75 yards and would score a touchdown off of a direct snap quarterback sneak to Durham Smythe. This play was comparable to a quarterback sneak that was run by Alec Ingold in the first game of the season. Durham Smythe would take that direct snap and he would sneak it 1 yard for the touchdown, and that would bring the score 19-14 at the end of the half. So as we can see, the game was a lot closer than what it ended up as. The Dolphins would start the second half with the possession, and they would get an 11-play, 47-yard drive that took a total of 6 minutes and 20 seconds. 11 plays, 47 yards, 6 minutes and 20 seconds. That's a long drive. Unfortunately, this drive would end up only in a 46-yard field goal by Jason Sanders, and that would bring the score 19-17, and that would be the closest it would get for the rest of the game, outside of starting the game 0-0 and the safety that started the game essentially 2-0. This would be the closest that the Dolphins would get in surpassing and achieving the comeback. After that Jason Sanders field goal, the New York Jets would go 6 plays for 31 yards, but would end up losing the ball off of a 4th and 1 that was incomplete to Chris Davis, and they would turn the ball over on downs. The Dolphins would try to capitalize on that, but they were not able to, as they would go 3 plays, gaining 0 yards, and would end up having to punt the ball. The following possession for the Jets would go 6 plays, 19 yards, and they would have to punt. So as you can see, we started a little bit with a punt fest here in the second half. Ensuing Miami Dolphins possession, 6 plays, 43 yards, and it took 2 minutes and 7 seconds off the clock, but would culminate in a missed 54-yard field goal, which ended up wide right. And that, my friends, is where everything fell apart. The New York Jets would go 56 yards off of 7 plays, taking a total of 3 minutes and 53 seconds, and culminating that drive with a 1-yard touchdown rush by Michael Carter. On the ensuing possession for the Miami Dolphins, they would start off at their own 25-yard line. Their first play would end up in a delay of game that would take 5 yards back. And the ensuing play after that, Skylar Thompson would be sacked at the Miami 17, and he would fumble the ball. And upon fumbling the ball, it would be recovered by Quinnen Williams, and he'd take that fumble and return it down to the Miami 5-yard line, going a total of 12 yards. Right after that, the Jets would go 1 play, and this would end up in a touchdown as Breece Hall would rush right, and he would gain 5 yards and score a touchdown. This game was just at 19-17 at the end of the third quarter. And just about midway into the fourth quarter, all of a sudden, the score is now 33-17. At this point, the Miami Dolphins are in Hail Mary mode, trying to figure out to do anything at all, and unfortunately would not be able to do anything at all. They would go 4 plays on the ensuing possession, gaining only 5 yards and turning the ball over on downs. A questionable 4th-and-1 running play to the right that would lose 4 yards would end up being the end of that possession, and that was on their own 30-yard line. Ensuing possession for the Jets would go 5 plays, 30 yards for a total of 3 minutes and 7 seconds, and would culminate in a 15-yard touchdown rush by the former University of Miami Hurricane Braxton Berrios. At that point, the game is 40-17. The Dolphins would then, on the next possession, try to do something, and they would go 9 plays, 61 yards, taking a total of 3 minutes and 25 seconds. But the drive would end at the New York Jets' 14-yard line on a 4th-and-7 as Skylar Thompson would pass incomplete to his right to Myles Gaskin. Not only that, but there was also a penalty of an illegal formation, which was inevitably declined. At that point, that would be the end of the game. Zach Wilson would need to kneel the ball twice in order to do so and send the Jets to an above 500 record at 3-2, basically tied with the Dolphins at this point. So here's the overall review of this game in terms of what it means for the Fins and what it means for this division. The Miami Dolphins were down a ton of players. It was found out just before the beginning of the game that they were going to be without Xavier Howard. Tua Tagovailoa did not travel with the team, and we pretty much knew that he was going to be out as well. The Dolphins would have Skylar Thompson active, and they would sign Reed Sinnett, who had a spectacular preseason for the Dolphins last season. However, Reed Sinnett would not start the game active on the roster. So they would go into the game with 2 quarterbacks, and as soon as Teddy Bridgewater would go down, we immediately began to think, who is the emergency backup quarterback? And that was, in fact, Cedric Wilson. And thankfully, he was not forced to do any quarterbacking for this team in this game, which would have ended up turning a bad situation much worse. But nonetheless, I believe that this game, if there was ever going to be a game that the Jets were going to beat the Dolphins, this was going to be the game. And beyond that, I think even the Jets themselves overall look so much better than what they did last season. I think in general, the team is built much better and has a greater sense of depth on their team. Not to mention the rushing attack that the Jets have right now, along with their offensive line and how they're able to make holes and make things happen in the running game, really takes the pressure off of the quarterback situation for the Jets, which actually had been respectively led by Joe Flacco in the first few games, Zach Wilson being out for the first few games of the season. So here's what we look like as of right now. The Buffalo Bills are first in the division with a record of 4-1, followed by the New York Jets, who are 3-2, tied with the Dolphins, who are third, and the Patriots, who are dead last in the division at 2-3. Earlier in the season, when the Dolphins were projected as being one of the top 5 teams in the NFL in terms of power rankings, I immediately would look into the fact that the Dolphins were really only a few plays away from losing pretty much all of the games that they won. If you look back at the New England Patriots game, that game was a couple of bad plays gone awry to the point where the Patriots would have had a shot to win that game. I think there would have been a less chance of them losing that game specifically. But then when you go to the next few games, We had no business beating the Ravens the way we did. The Finns had absolutely no business beating the Ravens, but they did somehow. And that's what the good teams do. The good teams, they come back and they can supersede whatever adversity is thrown their way. In the game against the Bills, I really think that if Josh Allen would not have bobbled the snap at the end of the first half and they hit that field goal, is a realistic possibility that the Bills would have won that game had they tried that field goal or had they been able to try that field goal. Not only that, but you also had some bad plays by Josh Allen and all of the missed interceptions by the Miami Dolphins. In theory, you could say that that game we should have lost as well. But we didn't. And a lot of the power rankings, they'll reflect the fact that the good teams, they can overcome adversity and get on top. So here we are, 3-2, going into the game this week against the Vikings with the possibility of ending up at 500. The bright spot for this game coming up against the Vikings, however, is the fact that we had full participation from both Xavier Howard and Byron Jones. So there's a possibility, a pretty likely possibility that we're going to see both Byron Jones and Xavier Howard in this game, which I think will help tremendously with the prospects of winning this game. There are a few questions on the injury front, though. Teddy Bridgewater is currently listed as questionable. I'm going to assume that he's going to be active for this game. But in addition to his concussion issue, there was also a right pectoral injury. So there's a possibility there that he may actually not be active in this game, which would leave Skylar Thompson and Reed Sinnett as your only two active quarterbacks against the Vikings. Mike McDaniels did announce that Skylar Thompson would, in fact, start the game against the Vikings. Tua Tagovailoa, despite having cleared the concussion protocol, he has been listed as out for the game against the Vikings, despite being a full participant in Friday's practice. Kader Kohu is listed as doubtful for Sunday's game against the Vikings, which will probably mean he's not going to play. Outside of that, I think the success or failure of this game is going to be determined on the ability of Xavier Howard and Byron Jones, along with the game plan that Mike McDaniels and the coaching staff puts in place for Skylar Thompson. Overall, I think that if there's anybody that I trust in developing a game plan for a rookie quarterback such as Skylar Thompson, it's Mike McDaniel, and I think you're going to see heavy dosages of running attack along with a lot of short dink and dunk passes with the occasional shot down the field. I think given the fact that Skylar has had all of the starters reps this week, that's going to help a lot in terms of timing, in terms of being able to anticipate where the likes of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are going to be. And overall, I think it can be a game that the Dolphins can win. A lot of what the Dolphins do or don't do is going to really be determined on the game plan and on the ability of the defense to cover the likes of Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. In terms of the injury report for the Minnesota Vikings, there are definitely not as many to report outside of Alexander Madison, who is currently listed as questionable, the running back, and linebacker DJ Wonum, who's listed as having an illness and has not practiced neither Thursday nor Friday, who is also listed as questionable. In conclusion, I think that the Dolphins really, and I cannot stress this enough, really need to perform well in the running game and need to perform well in general to pull this one out. And I think winning this game, despite all the adversity that they've faced, is going to set up this team into having the momentum to continue to build on the things that have made them successful in the first three games. This is John Acosta And this has been Miami Dolphins instant reaction for Game 5 of the NFL season of 2022. Please continue to follow us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Instagram as Double G Show, along with listening to these recaps after each and every Miami Dolphins game throughout the 2022 NFL season. I look forward to the next episode shortly after the Minnesota Vikings game coming up this Sunday, October 16th at 1 p.m. from Miami Gardens. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you soon.